Chapter 1. The Sanctuary of Silence. The rain lashed against the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Truth be told, I liked the storm because it drowned out the hum in my blood. I looked down at my hands. They were encased in heavy, lead-lined gloves that reached my elbows. Because of that, I felt like a prisoner in my own skin. I wore them because my touch was a weapon I didn't want to use. Maybe it was fate that brought the wolf to my door, but it felt like a curse. Suddenly, a massive weight slammed against my porch. I jumped. The bottle of antiseptic slipped from my grip, shattering on the floor. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The wind howled, but underneath, it was a low, wet, rasping sound. It was the sound of someone or something suffering. In that moment, I knew my quiet life was over. I reached for the door handle, my gloved hand trembling. Without thinking, I threw back the bolts and pulled the door open. The freezing wind nearly knocked me over. What followed was a sight that made my heart stop. A wolf lay there. Its fur was a shimmering, moonlight silver. Yet the silver was matted with thick, dark blood. 3 black-fleshed arrows were buried in its side. The tips glowed with a sick, purple light, forbidden silver. Not only that, the wolf was huge. It was the size of a small horse. Its eyes were closed, but it let out a whimper that vibrated in my chest. Have you ever felt a sound in your soul? I felt this. It was a cry for help from a monster that could kill me in a second. To make things worse, I could smell the hunters in the air, wet iron, and old smoke. Moments later, I grabbed the wolf's thick scruff and pulled. I am a small woman, but fear gave me strength. I dragged the massive beast into my kitchen and kicked the door shut. As the sky darkened, the wolf opened its eyes. They were molten gold. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of a king who had lost his throne. Before either could speak, the wolf's gaze locked onto mine. A beat later, I felt a spark. It wasn't in my hands. It was in my head. And just like that, everything changed. Chapter 2. The Surgical Sacrifice. The wolf's breath came in ragged, bloody gasps. Next, I looked at my lead gloves. If I wanted to save him, I had to take them off. If I took them off, the council would find me. Still, I couldn't let him die on my floor. I am a doctor. I save lives. I hide secrets. I wait for the end. Without another word, I began to unlace the heavy leather. My skin felt cold as the lead fell away. What's worse was the sudden roar of the void in my head. It was a silent scream, a vacuum that wanted to swallow every bit of magic in the room. As if pulled by a string, my bare hand reached for the first arrow. Because of that, the wolf's fur stood on end. The moment their eyes locked, the air thickened. I felt his pain, as if it were mine. I gripped the shaft of the first arrow. Truth be told, it felt like holding a lightning bolt. Because I am a void-born, my body began to drink the silver poison. It burned like liquid fire. Yet, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. "Stay with me," I whispered. My voice trembled, but my hands were steady. I pulled. The wolf let out a sound that was half howl and half scream. After that, the arrow came free. A spray of black blood hit my face. It tasted like copper and old magic. In that moment, I felt a surge of energy so powerful it knocked me back hard against the cabinets. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the void inside me began to purr. It was eating the poison. It was cleaning him. I moved to the second arrow. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the heat between them. It was a physical wall of pressure. It was a primal resonance. It was the sound of 2 stars colliding. Without thinking, I ripped the second and third arrows out in one motion. The wolf went limp. For a second, I thought I had killed him. Then, the space between them burned. A golden light began to leak from his wounds. It wasn't the purple of the poison, it was the gold of his life force. Eventually, the wolf's body began to stretch and crack, a sound like breaking branches. In the stillness that followed, the silver fur began to recede. I watched, breathless, as a man's shoulder appeared, then a back, then a hand. Beneath the moonlight, a man was being born from the beast. What followed was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen. The wolf was gone. In its place was a man with hair the color of midnight and a body built for war. His skin was covered in scars. But the wounds I had just cleaned were already closing. As the silence roared, I realized what I had done. I hadn't just saved a wolf. I had saved the king. Chapter 3. The King's Claim. The man on my floor was a giant. Truth be told, his presence made my cabin feel like a birdcage. Next, he opened his eyes. They were still that molten, terrifying gold. The moment their eyes locked, my world tilted. I felt a tugging at my navel, a physical chain of light snapping into place between us. "You!" His voice was a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Before she could move, he was on his feet. He moved with the grace of a predator, even though he was naked and covered in my antiseptic. Because of that, I backed away until I hit the cold stone of my fireplace. "Don't come closer," I warned. My voice trembled, but I held up my bare hands. "I'm Voidborn. I'll strip the power right out of your bones." Yet, he didn't stop. With his scent in the air, I felt my own wolf stir for the first time in years. Cedar, snow, and something dark. Under the weight of his stare, I felt my knees go weak. He stopped inches from me. The heat coming off his body was like a furnace. "You saved me," he said. His voice hung in the air like a threat. "But you are a thief. You stole the silence from my head." What followed was a moment of pure, electric terror. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. Without thinking, I tried to pull away, but then, as the bond pulsed, I didn't feel the cold drain of the void. Instead, I felt a surge of power. It was like a dam breaking. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized the resonance was real. "What are you?" I breathed. My heart skipped a beat as his thumb brushed over my pulse point. "I am Silas Obsidian," he whispered. When her name left his lips, I felt my soul answer. "And you are the woman who just declared war on the council to keep me alive." Not only that, but he looked at my lead-lined gloves on the floor. He let out a low, dark chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. Moments later, he pulled me flush against his chest. It was a collision of ice and fire. She didn't know what scared her more, the men hunting him, or the way she wanted to melt into his arms. "They are coming, Elara," he said. His eyes darkened until they were almost black. "The Silver Hunters. They tracked my blood to your door. Because of that, you are coming with me." Just like that, my choice was made for me. I looked at my small, safe home. Then I looked at the king. As the silence stretched, I realized I didn't want the lead gloves anymore. I wanted the fire. Her body moved on instinct as she reached up to touch his face. Between them, something cracked. It was the last of my resolve. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Obsidian Throne. The wind outside changed. It wasn't the random howling of a storm anymore. Now, it carried the rhythmic beat of heavy boots. Next, I heard the clicking of crossbows being loaded. To make things worse, I could see the glow of silver torches through the mist. The Shadow Society had arrived. "They're here," I whispered. My heart raced as I looked at the door. "They'll kill us both." They'll burn this place to the ground. Still, Silas didn't look afraid. In fact, a growl rose in his throat that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting. He let go of my wrist and stepped toward the door. As if summoned, the shadows in the corners of my room began to move. They crawled toward him, wrapping around his legs like living smoke. "Let them come," he said. The air thickened with the smell of old magic. They think they hunt a dying wolf. They don't realize they've found their king. What followed was a display of power that made my bones ache. Silas didn't shift back into a wolf. Instead, he stayed in his human form, his hands glowing with a dark, oily light. Without another word, he kicked my door open. The rain was still falling, but it seemed to avoid him. Beneath the moonlight, I saw at least 10 hunters in silver armor. "Give us the beast, girl," a voice shouted from the dark. "And maybe we'll let you die. Quickly." Because of that, Silas let out a roar that shook the trees. Not only that, but the shadows he had gathered shot forward like spears. I watched in horror and awe as the hunters were pulled into the darkness. It was fast. It was brutal. It was a king, defending his mate. Yet, I could feel his strength flagging. The silver poison had been drained, but his body was still weak. As her wolf stirred, I knew I had to help. I stepped out onto the porch, my bare hands glowing with the white light of the void. "Look at me!" I screamed. The hunters turned, their eyes wide with shock. A nullifier. A voidborn. The moment their eyes locked on me, I unleashed the vacuum. In that moment, the silver torches went out. The magical armor of the hunters turned into heavy, useless tin. Time stood still as Silas moved through the powerless men like a god of death. He was a blur of silver and shadow. Eventually, the forest was silent again. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I collapsed to my knees. The void had taken everything out of me. Moments later, I felt Silas's strong arms wrap around me. He pulled me against his chest, his heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my ear. "You are a warrior," he murmured. As the echo faded, I felt him press a kiss to my temple. It was a brand. It was a promise. But this cabin is gone. We go to the Obsidian Citadel. That's why. You need to hold on tight. Before I could speak, he shifted. The silver wolf was back, but this time, he was strong. He nudged my hand with his wet nose. As if fate demanded it, I climbed onto his back, burying my fingers in his thick, moonlight fur. The wind carried his name as we leapt into the dark. I was leaving my life behind. But as the bond pulsed, I knew I was finally going home. The smell of death was gone. Now, there was only the scent of him. And as we ran, I realized the king didn't just claim my soul. He gave me a reason to use it. Chapter 5. The Flight of the Damned. The wind didn't just bite, it tried to tear the soul right out of my body. I clung to the silver fur of the massive wolf, my fingers buried deep in his heat, while the world around us turned into a nightmare of speed and shadows. The forest was a blur of black and silver. Because Silas was a king, his wolf was faster than any animal I had ever seen. Still, the wind felt like cold glass against my cheeks. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my face into his neck. That's why I could smell the storm, the pine, and the heavy, musky scent of him. It was a smell that promised safety even though I was riding a monster. Moments later, the ground seemed to fall away. We weren't just running, we were leaping over ravines that would have swallowed a car. Every time his paws hit the earth, I felt the primal resonance jolt through my spine. It was a physical hum, like a giant tuning fork had been struck inside my chest. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't pull away from the feeling. It felt like coming home and falling off a cliff at the same time. Before she could think, Silas slowed his pace. The air grew thick and heavy with the smell of sulfur and old stone. As if fate demanded it, I looked up. We were no longer in the woods. We were standing at the base of a mountain that looked like a jagged tooth biting the moon. This was the Obsidian throne. Deep down, she knew the truth. There was no going back to the cabin. Her old life was as dead as the hunters back in the clearing. Without warning, Silas shifted. The transition was a wet, cracking sound that made my stomach flip. Within the span of a breath, the giant wolf was gone. In his place stood the man, naked and steaming in the cold night air. He didn't seem to notice the freezing wind because his blood was running with the heat of the bond. He turned to me, his golden eyes glowing with a predatory intensity. "Welcome to the end of your peace, Elara," he whispered. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in my very bones. In the silence that followed, he reached for my hand. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was a void-born, in the heart of the Shiffter kingdom. What followed was the heavy sound of a massive stone gate grinding open. The Obsidian Citadel was waiting, and it looked like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. Chapter 6. The Volcanic Heart. The inside of the mountain was a maze of dark corridors and glowing lava. Next, I saw the Shifters. They weren't like the hermits I treated in the woods. These were warriors in black leather and steel. Because I was walking beside their king, they dropped to their knees. Still, I could feel their eyes on me. They could smell the void on my skin. To them, I was a walking graveyard. As the silence roared, Silas led me into a massive hall. The ceiling was so high I couldn't see the top. Fire leapt from bowls carved into the walls. Rather than feeling warm, I felt a chill of pure dread. At the end of the hall sat a throne made of black glass. It was sharp. It was cold. It was exactly like the man who claimed me. "My king!" a woman shouted, stepping out of the shadows. She was beautiful in a sharp, lethal way. Her eyes were a piercing blue, and she looked at me like I was a bug she wanted to squash. "You're injured, and you brought a human?" "She is not just a human, Lyra," Silas growled. The tension broke as he stepped in front of me, his body shielding me from her gaze. "She is a void-born, and she is my mate." In that moment, the entire room went dead quiet. You could hear the lava bubbling in the distance. The woman, Lyra, gasped. Not only that, but the guards behind her gripped their spears tighter. They knew the legends. A void-born mate for an Obsidian king was a sign of the end times. She felt it clear as day. They didn't want a queen. They wanted a sacrifice. Eventually, Silas turned back to me. He didn't care about their shock. He only cared about the resonance that was pulling us together like magnets. He leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. "Don't listen to them," he murmured. "They fear what they cannot control, and they cannot control you." What followed was a walk to the highest tower. Silas moved with a limp that he tried to hide, but I saw it. The silver poison had done deep damage. Truth be told, he was only standing because of my touch. As the wind shifted outside the tower windows, I realized I was a prisoner in a gilded cage. But when his hand brushed mine, my soul answered. And all at once, everything changed. Chapter 7. The Searing Silence. The king's bedroom was a place of shadows and silk. Come morning, the sun would hit the volcanic glass and make the room glow. But now, it was a dark sanctuary. Silas sat on the edge of the massive bed, his chest heaving. Because he had used his magic to save us, his inner wolf was starting to roar again. I could see the black veins of the obsidian wolf creeping up his neck. "Touch me," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a plea for survival. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I stepped toward him. My hands were bare. I didn't have my lead gloves to protect me anymore. I reached out. my fingers trembling as they touched the hard muscle of his shoulder. The moment their eyes locked, the world narrowed. The void inside me rushed out, meeting his dark energy in a violent collision. It wasn't a drain this time. It was a balance. The black veins on his neck began to recede. The space between them burned with a passion that made my heart skip. It was more than just healing. It was a soul-deep connection that felt like a drug. "I can feel you," Silas whispered. He pulled me closer until I was standing between his knees. His hands found my waist. His grip so tight it left bruises. "I can feel the silence you bring. It's the only time the beast stops screaming." She didn't know what scared her more, the power she had over him, or the way her body wanted to surrender. He leaned his forehead against my stomach, breathing me in. Just like that, the protective tyrant was gone. In his place was a man who was drowning. I ran my hands through his dark hair, the resonance pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. "Is this why you brought me here?" I asked, my voice a soft whisper. "To be your medicine?" But then he looked up. His golden eyes were filled with a hunger that wasn't about blood. "I brought you here because you are mine," he said. He stood up, towering over me. Without thinking, I reached up to trace the line of his jaw. The air thickened until it was hard to breathe. He leaned in, his lips inches from mine. "I brought you here because I would burn the world to find you." What followed was a kiss that felt like a war. It was desperate. It was hungry. It was the burning, intense fire of a bond that had been waiting 1,000 years. As the mark tingled on my neck, I realized I didn't want to be invisible anymore. I wanted to be his. Yet, as his hands moved over my skin, a shadow of a doubt crossed my mind. What was he really hiding? Chapter 8. The Map of Betrayal. Silas fell into a deep sleep after the healing, his body finally at peace. Still, I couldn't rest. My thoughts spun like a hurricane. I stood up and looked around the room. It was filled with ancient books and scrolls. Because I was curious, I began to look through the papers on his desk. I told myself I was looking for a way to help him, but deep down, I was looking for the truth. Moments later, I found a leather satchel tucked away in a drawer. It was covered in the same black feathers as the arrows that had hit him. My heart pounded against my ribs as I opened it. Inside wasn't a weapon. It was a map. It was a map of the Blackwood Peaks, where my cabin was located. As the truth unraveled, my blood turned to ice. The map was old. It was covered in notes written in Silas's sharp, elegant handwriting. There were dates going back years. There were descriptions of me. The Voidborn, the last thorn, the healer of silence. He hadn't found my cabin by accident in the storm. He had been tracking me for a long time. "No," I whispered. My voice trembled as I dropped the map. It was a trap. Before I could move, the shadows in the room began to stir. I turned around to see Silas standing by the bed. He wasn't the vulnerable man from an hour ago. He was the king again. He looked at the map on the floor, and then he looked at me. His expression was a mask of cold obsidian. "You were looking for me," I said, my chest aching. "The arrows, the storm. You planned all of it just to get me here." Rather than denying it, Silas stepped into the light. "I knew who you were the moment you arrived at the hospital 7 years ago," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth from our kiss. "I needed a Voidborn to stabilize my throne. I needed you to save my sanity. Does the reason matter? If the bond is real?" And just like that, everything changed. I looked at the man I had just shared my soul with and saw a stranger. I had saved a monster, and he had used my heart as a leash. To make things worse, the door to the chamber burst open. Lyra stood there, a cruel smile on her face. "The council is at the gates, Silas," she said. "They know the Voidborn is here. They want her head, or they want your crown." Between them, something cracked. Silas looked at me, then at Lyra. I didn't wait for his answer. I backed toward the window, the void pulse in my hands screaming for release. I had saved a beast, but I wouldn't be his prisoner. The cliffhanger hung in the air like a blade. Was I his mate? Or just his most valuable weapon? Chapter 9. The Siege of Shadows. The sound of the council's silver horns didn't just announce war, it sounded like the death of my heart. I stared at Silas, the map of my life still clutched in my shaking hands while the walls of the Obsidian Citadel groaned under the weight of an invisible attack. The floor beneath my feet vibrated with a low, humming power. Next, a loud explosion rocked the tower, sending shards of volcanic glass flying across the room. Still, Silas didn't blink. He just watched me with those golden eyes that now looked like cold, hard coins. I saw the truth. I saw the trap. I saw the man I thought I loved turn into the predator he always was. "You used me," I whispered. My voice was a jagged edge in the small room. "You lured me here like an animal, to a cage." Soon after, Silas stepped toward me, but I raised my hands, the white light of the void flickering around my fingers. Because of that, he stopped, a flicker of pain crossing his face. To make things worse, the door burst open again. Lyra wasn't alone this time. 6 warriors in heavy armor stood behind her, their eyes fixed on me. "The Archon is at the gates, Silas." Lyra screamed over the sound of the crumbling stone. "He says he can smell the void born from the valley. If you don't give her up, he will bring the mountain down on all our heads." Truth be told, I didn't know what scared her more, the army outside or the king standing in front of me. Silas growled, a sound that started deep in his chest and made the shadows in the room crawl up the walls. Even so, he didn't look at Lyra. He only looked at me. "I am the king," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. "Command, and no one takes what is mine." Before she could move, everything changed. Silas lunged at the guards, his hands turning into claws of pure shadow. What followed was a blur of violence and dark magic. He wasn't just fighting. He was protecting the entrance to the room. In fact, he fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. Deep down, she knew the truth. He was a liar. But he was the only thing standing between her and a council executioner. Chapter 10. The Healer's Dilemma. The room grew quiet as the last guard fell to the floor. Next, Silas turned to me, his chest heaving and his skin slick with sweat. Because he was away from my touch, the obsidian wolf was clawing its way back to the surface. I could see the black veins pulsing under his jaw. Rather, I could feel his agony through the bond, a sharp stabbing pain in the center of my chest. "Go with Lyra," Silas ordered. His voice was a ragged mess of human and beast. "She will take you to the lower levels. The stone there is reinforced with lead. They won't be able to sense you." "Why should I trust her?" I snapped. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. "She wants me dead as much as they do." But then, Silas grabbed my shoulders. The moment their eyes locked, the room seemed to disappear. His touch was cold, but the resonance between us was a screaming fire. Maybe it was fate, but I saw a flash of his memory. I saw a young Silas standing over the body of his father. I saw the same silver arrows that had nearly killed him. "Because I am ordering her to keep you alive," Silas whispered. What followed was a moment of raw vulnerability. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "If I fall today, Elara, run. Don't look back. Don't save. Fall anyone else." In that moment, my heart skipped. I hated him for the map. I hated him for the lies. Yet, as his scent of cedar and smoke filled my lungs, I realized I couldn't let him die. I was his cure. I was his weapon. I was his captive. I'm not going to the cellar, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. If they want a Voidborn, let's give them one. Chapter 11. The Burning Distance. Silas left for the front lines, and the separation felt like my skin was being peeled off. Because of the primal resonance, every step he took away from me felt like a physical weight on my lungs. Next, Lyra grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice. She didn't lead me to the cellar. Instead, she pulled me toward a hidden balcony that overlooked the main gate. "Watch," Lyra hissed. Her voice was full of a bitter poison. "Watch what happens when a king tries to keep a curse as a pet." Below us, the valley was a sea of silver armor. High Archon Valerius stood at the front, holding a staff that glowed with a blinding, white light. What's worse was the sight of Silas. He stood alone at the gate, his shadows clashing against the white light of the council's magic. With every heartbeat, I felt his strength failing. He was drowning in the static of his own mind. "He's dying," I breathed. The air thickened with the smell of ozone and burning magic. Without thinking, I climbed onto the stone railing. The wind whipped my hair across my face. But I didn't care. "What are you doing, you fool?" Lyra shouted. She reached for me, but I pushed her back with a pulse of cold energy. "I'm finishing what he started," I said. Truth be told, I didn't know if I would survive. As if pulled by a string, I closed my eyes and reached out for the bond. I didn't try to pull the power into me. Rather, I tried to push my silence into him. I wanted to be the anchor in his storm. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the bond pulsed. It was a golden cord of light that stretched from my heart down to the battlefield. Suddenly, Silas froze. His head snapped up, and he looked directly at me. And just like that, everything changed. The black veins on his face vanished. He let out a roar that wasn't a cry of pain, it was a call to war. Chapter 12. The Traitor's Scent. The battle turned into a slaughter. Next, the white light of the Archon's staff flickered and died as my void energy began to drain the magic from the field. Because Silas was finally in control of his beast, he moved like a god of shadows. He tore through the silver-clad soldiers until he reached Valerius. Still, something felt wrong. The air around me began to smell like the forbidden silver arrows. "You think you've won?" Lyra whispered from behind me. She didn't know what scared her more, the look on her face, or the small silver dagger she was holding. Before I could move, she pressed the blade against my neck. To make things worse, I realized the dagger was coated in the same purple poison that had almost killed Silas. As the silence roared, I realized Lyra wasn't just a jealous rival. She was the one who had sent the arrows. She was the one who had invited the Archon. "Silas won't choose you," Lyra hissed. Her eyes were wide and manic. "He'll choose the crown. He always does. And once you're dead, the silence will be gone. And he'll have to come back to me to lead his armies." Just like that, I understood the final piece of the trap. Silas had tracked me to use me, but Lyra had tracked me to kill me. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't reach the void. The lead in the balcony floor was blocking her power. "Silas!" I tried to scream, but my voice failed as the poison on the blade began to sting. My skin. Below, Silas had Valerius by the throat. He was seconds away from victory, yet, in the span of a breath, he stopped. He felt my terror. He felt the poison. He looked up, and his face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The cliffhanger hung in the air like a heavy fog. Would he kill the man who murdered my family? Or would he let him go to save the mate he had lied to? Chapter 13. The Choice of a King. The smell of burning magic and betrayal was thick enough to choke on. I felt the cold, poisoned edge of Lyra's dagger bite into my skin, but my eyes were locked on Silas, who stood 100 feet below. On the blood-stained battlefield. The moment their eyes locked, the world seemed to stop spinning. Silas had High Archon Valerius by the throat, his claws inches away from ending the man who had destroyed my family. But then, he heard my gasp. Because the primal resonance made my fear his own, he felt the silver poison on Lyra's blade touching my neck. What's worse was the look of pure agony that crossed his face. As he realized the trap, let her go. "Lyra!" Silas roared. His voice was so loud it cracked the stone of the balcony beneath my feet. "Kill him, Silas!" Lyra screamed back, her hand shaking against my throat. "Kill the Archon and take your place as the ruler of all. The girl is nothing." Without warning, Silas made his choice. He let go of Valerius's throat and shoved him away. What followed was a moment of silence that felt like a death sentence. Silas didn't look at his fleeing enemy. Instead, he turned into a blur of silver and shadow, leaping up the side of the fortress like a mountain lion. She felt it clear as day. He was choosing me over his revenge, and that's why my heart felt like it was breaking in two. Moments later, Silas crashed onto the balcony. Before either could speak, he lunged at Lyra. As if pulled by a string, Lyra tried to plunge the dagger into my heart, but I moved on instinct. I slammed my elbow into her ribs, and the void light flared from my skin. Just like that, the poison dagger flew out of her hand and skittered across the stone. Silas was on her in a second, his shadow claws pinning her to the wall. "You were my general," Silas hissed. His eyes were no longer gold. They were a terrifying, midnight black. "You were my friend." "I was the only one who loved the king you were supposed to be," Lyra spat, even as the shadows began to choke her. Soon after, Silas tossed her aside like a broken doll. He didn't kill her, because he wanted her to suffer the shame of her betrayal in the dungeons. Rather, he turned to me, his hands shaking as he reached for my face. In the quiet that followed, I saw the blood on his hands and the tears in his eyes. He was a king. He was a monster. And he was the man who had just saved my life. Chapter 14. The Poisoned Pulse. The air thickened as I collapsed into Silas's arms. Because the silver dagger had nicked my skin, the poison was already starting to crawl through my veins, like ice water. To make things worse, Valerius had escaped during the chaos. That's why the victory felt like a hollow shell. I could feel the void inside me trying to eat the poison, but it was too much. "Elara, stay with me," Silas whispered. His voice trembled as he swept me up into his arms and carried me toward the royal chambers. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep her eyes open. With every heartbeat, the world grew darker. Deep down, she knew the truth. Silas had lied to her about the map, but he had also given up his chance for peace to save her. Maybe it was fate, but I felt the bond between us pulsing with a desperate, hungry heat. It was the only thing, keeping me tethered to the world. What followed was a frantic race through the dark corridors of the Obsidian Citadel. By the time we reached his bed, I was shivering so hard my teeth were chattering. Silas laid me down and ripped away my torn tunic to see the wound. It was a small, purple line on my neck, but it looked like a bruise on my soul. "I have to drain it," Silas said. He looked at me with a hunger that scared me. "But if I touch you without your gloves, the resonance will consume us both. It will be a burning fire. We can't put out." "Do it," I breathed. As the silence roared, I reached up and pulled him down to me. Without another word, Silas leaned in. His lips touched the wound on my neck, and the world exploded into a million pieces of light. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the void met the shadow. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a surrender. Chapter 15. The Sizzling Truth. Between one breath and the next, the room vanished. I wasn't just in his arms, I was in his head. Because of that, I saw the secret he had been hiding behind the map. I saw the day the council murdered his father. I saw that Silas didn't want a void-born weapon. He wanted a partner who could help him stop the cycle of blood. As the bond pulsed, the pain of the poison turned into a searing, intense pleasure. Silas's hands were everywhere on my waist, in my hair, pressing me against the silk sheets. The space between them burned with a desire that felt like a long-lost memory. Every touch felt like a bolt of lightning. In fact, it was the most intense thing I had ever felt. I didn't just track you because I needed you, Elara, Silas murmured against my skin. His voice was a low, seductive purr. I tracked you because I've been alone in the dark for so long, and you were the only light I could see. She didn't know what scared her more, the way he looked at her, or the way she wanted to give him everything. I pulled his head up so I could look into his golden eyes. The tension broke as I kissed him. It was a kiss of fire and ash. It was the kiss of two broken people who had finally found the missing piece of their souls. Don't lie to me again, I whispered against his lips. Her voice trembled, but her heart was steady. Never, Silas promised. As her wolf stirred, he moved over me, his body a heavy, welcome weight. Not only that, but the resonance amplified every sensation. I could feel his heart beating against mine. I could feel the shadows dancing on the walls, celebrating our union. Under the weight of his stare, I realized that the void wasn't a curse of death. It was the power to choose who I wanted to be. Chapter 16. The Shadow Hunt. Come morning, the sun hit the black glass walls, turning the room into a hall of mirrors. Still, the peace didn't last long. Next, there was a frantic knocking at the heavy oak doors. Silas sat up, his bare chest glistening in the light. Because the bond was fully open now, I could feel his sudden spike of alarm. What is it? Silas barked. He stood up and pulled on his black trousers, his movements fast and lethal. My king! Valerius has returned to the capital. A guard shouted through the door. But he didn't go alone. He has a weapon we've never seen. They're calling it the Silver Fog. What followed was a chill that made the hair on my neck stand up. Truth be told, I had heard stories of the fog. It was a chemical weapon designed to strip a shifter of their skin while they were still alive. To make things worse, Valerius was using the energy he stole from me on the battlefield to power it. As the truth unraveled, I realized I had accidentally given the enemy the keys to our destruction. He's going to wipe out the whole city, I whispered. I stood up, wrapping a silk robe around my body. Her heart skipped as Silas turned to look at me. He looked older. He looked like a king who was about to lose everything he had just fought for. I have to go to the council chambers, Silas said. His name hung in the air like a prayer. I have to challenge Valerius to a blood duel before the fog is released. But then, I grabbed his arm. The moment their eyes locked, I knew what I had to do. Deep down, she knew the truth. Silas couldn't win a blood duel against a man powered by void energy. Only a Voidborn could fight a Voidborn. And just like that, everything changed. I wasn't going to hide in the tower anymore. I was the secret weapon of the Obsidian throne. You're not going alone, I said. Without thinking, I reached for the lead-lined gloves on the floor and threw them into the fireplace. I watched them burn, the lead melting into the logs. From there, I looked at Silas with a fire in my eyes that matched his own, which meant the real war was only just beginning. Have you ever wondered what happens when a healer decides to become a storm? Valerius was about to find out. Chapter 17. The Lion's Den. The sky over the capital wasn't blue anymore. It was a bruised, sickly purple that made my skin crawl. I stood on the back of the silver wolf as we raced toward the High Council's golden domes, the wind screaming past us like a warning from the dead. After that, the city of the Shadow Society appeared through the mist. Its tall glass towers looked like jagged teeth against the dark sky. Truth be told, I had never seen the capital from the back of a king, and it was a sight that made my breath catch. Because the primal resonance was humming in my bones, I could feel Silas's heartbeat through my knees. He was a king, he was a warrior, and he was a man who was ready to die for his people. Next, we reached the massive iron gates of the council hall. Even so, the guards didn't try to stop us. They looked at the massive silver wolf and the woman with glowing white hands, and they simply stepped aside. Because of that, I realized just how much fear Silas commanded. He didn't need to roar. His presence was enough to turn the air into ice. What followed was a slow walk through the long, marble corridors. Silas shifted back into his human form as we walked, his black cloak billowing behind him like a cloud of smoke. In fact, he looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. She didn't know what scared her more, the army outside, or the silence inside these walls. "Stay close," Silas murmured. When her name left his lips, I felt a surge of warmth. He reached back and grabbed my hand, his grip firm and steady, which meant he wasn't just my king anymore. He was my anchor. The tension broke as we reached the double doors of the inner sanctum. This was the place where my family had been sentenced to death. And now, I was coming back to finish the story. Chapter 18. The Blood Duel Challenge. In the quiet that followed, the doors swung open to reveal a room filled with the most powerful shifters in the world. High Archon Valerius sat on a raised platform, his white staff glowing with the stolen energy of my void-born ancestors. To make things worse, the air in the room was thick with a shimmering purple dust. This was the silver fog, and it looked like a poisonous dream. "You're late, Silas," Valerius said. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Because he was using my power, his eyes were a milky, terrifying white. "I was just about to start the execution of the city." "I challenge you, Valerius," Silas roared. What followed was a gasp that rippled through the room. A blood duel was an ancient law that no shifter could ignore. Still, Silas was weak from the poison, and Valerius was stronger than ever. That's why I stepped forward, my hands beginning to glow with a blinding white light. "The king doesn't fight alone," I said. My voice didn't tremble this time. As if pulled by a string, I channeled the void pulse into the floor, making the marble crack. In that moment, I saw a flicker of fear in the Archon's eyes. He wasn't just looking at a doctor. He was looking at the woman who could turn his magic into dust. But then, Valerius began to laugh. It was a sound that made my chest ache. He looked at the purple mist swirling around our feet and raised his staff. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized he wasn't going to follow the rules. Maybe it was fate, but the trap was already sprung. "The blood duel is for shifters," he hissed, "but the fog is for everyone." Chapter 19. The Fog Unleashed. Without warning, the purple dust exploded into a thick, choking cloud. Before she could move, the mist touched my skin, and it felt like 1,000 needles were being driven into my pores. What's worse was the sound Silas made. It was a broken, animalistic scream of agony. Because the silver fog was designed to burn shifter skin, he was being eaten alive by the air itself. And all at once, everything changed. I tried to reach for him, but the mist was so thick I couldn't see my own hands. As the silence roared, I felt the primal resonance begin to flicker. It was like a candle being blown out by a cold wind. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't find the cord of light that connected her heart to his. "Silas!" I screamed. Her voice trembled as I stumbled through the purple haze. In the span of a breath, I felt the bond snap. The space between them burned, and then it went cold. It was a silence so loud it felt like my ears were bleeding. I was alone in the dark, and for the first time in my life, the void didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a tomb. Soon after, I heard the sound of heavy boots. The silver hunters were moving in the mist. Because the fog had severed our bond, I couldn't sense Silas anymore. She felt it clear as day. I was just a human girl again, hiding in a room full of monsters. As her wolf stirred, I realized that the void was the only thing I had left. I reached deep inside my soul and grabbed the vacuum. Chapter 20. The Severed Bond. Between one breath and the next, I unleashed the void. I didn't just drain the magic. I tried to swallow the fog itself. The air thickened as a white vortex began to spin around me, sucking the purple poison into my skin. It burned like 1,000 fires. But I didn't stop, because if I stopped, Silas would die. In fact, I could feel my own life force being pulled out with the mist. Eventually, the room began to clear. I saw the shifters slumped on the floor, their skin red and blistered, but then I saw Silas. He was in his wolf form, but he wasn't the majestic silver beast anymore. He was small, his fur falling out in clumps, and his eyes were a dull, lifeless gray, which meant the fog had done more than just burn him. It had taken his beast. "Silas," I whispered. I tried to walk toward him, but my legs gave out. Her thoughts spun as I realized that Valerius was still standing. He had been protected by his staff, and now he was walking toward the broken king, with a silver sword in his hand. To make things worse, I was too weak to move. Deep down, she knew the truth. The bond was gone. The king was broken. And just like that, everything changed. Valerius raised the sword over Silas's neck, a cruel smile on his face. As though fate whispered, I realized there was one more secret I hadn't used. Before the words left her lips, I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. As the sky darkened, a voice I hadn't heard in years echoed through the hall. "Leave the boy alone." Valerius. Under the weight of his stare, a man stepped out of the shadows who looked exactly like Silas but older. Her heart skipped a beat as I realized the secret of the Obsidian bloodline was finally coming to light. Chapter 21. The Ghost King's Betrayal. The cold in the room didn't come from the mountain, it came from the man who was supposed to be a pile of bones in a royal tomb. I stared at the figure stepping out of the shadows, and my heart felt like it was being squeezed by a giant's hand. What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in on us. The man looked exactly like a version of Silas from 20 years ago. He had the same sharp jaw, the same molten gold eyes, and the same terrifying aura of power. In that moment, I realized the truth. This was Alaric Obsidian, the king who was murdered by his own council. Still, he didn't look like a victim. He looked like a hunter. "Father?" Silas's voice was a broken whimper. He was still in his wolf form, but he was shivering, his silver fur matted with the purple poison. "You were always too weak, Silas," Alaric said. His voice was like a cold wind blowing through a graveyard. Because he was standing right next to Valerius, I realized they weren't enemies. They were partners. That's why my world tilted. The man Silas had mourned for years was the one who had planned his downfall. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't understand why a father would do this to his own son. As the sky darkened, Valerius stepped forward and handed the silver sword to Alaric. Soon after, the Ghost King looked down at Silas with a disgust that made my blood boil. She felt it clear as day. This wasn't a reunion. It was an execution. Not only that, but the silver fog was still swirling around us, and without the bond, I couldn't protect Silas anymore. Without warning, Alaric raised the sword. "A king who chooses a human mate is no king at all," he hissed. Between one breath and the next, he swung the blade. I screamed, but before the metal could bite into Silas's neck, Valerius stopped him. Rather, he pointed his staff at me. "Not yet, Alaric," Valerius murmured. "We need the Voidborn alive to power the ley lines. Once she's drained, you can have your revenge." Chapter 22. The Broken Crown. Moments later, the Silver Hunters swarmed the room like a pack of starving dogs. Because I was exhausted from swallowing the fog, I couldn't fight them off. They grabbed my arms, and the cold iron of their lead-lined shackles snapped shut around my wrists. Just like that, the void inside me went silent. It felt like being buried alive. In my own body. What's worse was what they did to Silas. She didn't know what scared her more, the way he looked at her or the way he didn't fight back. He lay there on the marble floor, a wolfless, broken man. In fact, the fog had stripped his shifter spirit so completely that his golden eyes had turned a dull, lifeless brown. Deep down, she knew the truth. Silas wasn't just losing his crown. He was losing himself. "Silas, look at me!" I cried out. Her voice trembled as the guards dragged me away. "Have you ever felt your soul being ripped out, through your throat?" That was the feeling of our severed bond. Even so, he didn't look up. He just stared at the blood on the floor, the blood of the man he thought was his hero. As a result, the guards threw me into a dark, lead-lined cage. Truth be told, I had spent my whole life trying to hide from the council, and now I was their most valuable prize. As the silence roared, I heard the heavy iron door of the dungeon slam shut, which meant I was alone. No Silas, no void, no hope. The space between us burned with the memory of his touch. But now, that memory felt like a lie. Chapter 23. The Iron Cage of Memories. In the quiet that followed, I slumped against the cold stone wall. The dungeon smelled of damp earth and old death. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't stop the tears from falling. Because the bond was broken, the physical pain was agonizing. Every cell in my body was screaming for Silas. Rather, it was screaming for the man I thought he was. Maybe it was fate, but I remembered the first time he looked at me in my cabin. I remembered the heat of his skin and the way he promised to burn the world to find me. What followed was a scenario that played over and over in my head. Him tracking me, him lying to me, him choosing me. Still, none of it mattered now. He was a broken shell, and I was a battery for a madman. Moments later, a small window in the door slid open. A pair of cold, blue eyes looked through the bars. It was Lyra. In fact, she looked happy to see me in chains. She felt it clear as day. She had lost her king, but she had won the war. "The Archon is preparing the ritual, Doctor," Lyra sneered. "They're going to use your blood to fuel the silver fog on a global scale. By tomorrow morning, there won't be a shifter left on Earth who isn't a slave to the Obsidian throne." "And what about Silas?" I asked, my voice a jagged whisper. "Silas is in the cell next to yours," she said, her smile widening. "But don't worry, he can't hear you. He's wolfless, a human, a nothing." And just like that, everything changed. She slammed the window shut, leaving me in the dark with the sound of my own heartbeat. Under the weight of his stare, I realized that the Ghost King hadn't just returned to lead, he had returned to replace his son. Chapter 24. All Seems Lost. That night, the silence in the dungeon was louder than any storm. Because the lead-lined walls blocked all magic, I felt like I was suffocating. I pressed my ear against the stone wall, hoping, praying, to hear something from the cell next door. As the wind shifted through the vents, I finally heard it. It was a low, broken sob. "Silas?" I whispered. Her heart skipped as I waited for an answer. Without thinking, I tapped on the stone with my shackles. Clink, clink, clink. "Elara?" His voice was so weak I almost missed it. It was the voice of a man who had been stripped of his skin, his soul, and his pride. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have stayed in the woods. I should have let the silver kill me." "No," I said, pressing my face against the cold stone. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized I didn't care about the lies or the map anymore. Truth be told, I just wanted him to live. You're a king, Silas. Wolfless or not, you're the man who chose me. Over revenge. But then, the silence returned. As though fate whispered, I realized that Silas had given up. He had let his father's betrayal break his spirit. To make things worse, I could feel the void energy being pulled out of me through the floor. The ritual had started. In the span of a breath, my vision blurred and my strength failed. As the silence roared, I looked up at the ceiling and saw the purple light of the silver fog beginning to leak through the vents. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was the end. The council had won. The bond was dead. And just like that, everything changed. A single, silver tear fell from my eye and hit the lead-lined floor. Chapter 25. The Heart of the Void. The lead beneath my feet didn't just feel cold, it felt like a hunger that was finally meeting its match. I watched as my silver tear hit the gray floor, and instead of soaking into the stone, it began to glow with a blinding, white light that made my vision swim. After that, I realized the council had made a terrible mistake. They thought the lead-lined floor was a prison for my magic, but they didn't know the history of my people. Because my blood was void-born, it didn't just drain away. It looked for a way to fight back against the dark. Truth be told, Lead isn't just a shield. It's a conduit. It's a mirror. And right now, it was reflecting all the energy Valerius was stealing from me and sending it right back into my heart. Before she could move, the shackles on my wrists began to vibrate. It was a high, screaming sound that made my teeth ache. Because of that, I stopped crying and started to focus. I closed my eyes and reached deep into the stone. I didn't try to pull the power. I just opened the door. What followed was an explosion of white light that turned the dungeon into a sun. The lead restraints didn't just break, they turned into dust. In that moment, I stood up, and I didn't feel weak anymore. I felt like a storm that had been trapped in a bottle for too long. Not only that, but I could feel the void pulse moving through the floor like a heartbeat. It was searching for Silas. Maybe it was fate, but the lead in the walls was carrying my voice to him. I was a healer. I was a weapon. I was a queen. Moments later, I walked to the heavy iron door and touched the lock. It didn't stand a chance. The metal melted under my hand as if it were made of butter. As the silence roared, I stepped out into the hallway and looked at the cell next to mine. "Silas, get back from the door!" I shouted. Her voice wasn't trembling anymore. It was the voice of a woman who was ready to take back her kingdom. Chapter 26. The Restoration of the King. Next, I tore the door to Silas's cell off its hinges. The room inside was pitch black, but my glowing hands lit it up like a torch. Silas was curled in the corner, his skin pale and his eyes filled with a hollow darkness. Because the fog had taken his wolf, he looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Deep down, she knew the truth. He was a wolfless, broken man. "Elara?" he whispered, shielding his eyes from my light. "What are you doing? You have to run. My father, he's coming for you. Your father is a ghost, Silas, I said, kneeling beside him. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I reached out and grabbed his hands. He tried to pull away, but I held him tight. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the way the resonance felt now. It wasn't a physical chain anymore. It was a choice. Because the bond was forged in pain, only a greater love could bring it back to life. I don't have a wolf, Elara, he choked out, his chest heaving. I'm just a man. I can't protect you. But then, I leaned in and pressed my forehead against his. Then let me protect you, I whispered. What followed was a transfer of energy that made the mountain itself begin to tremble. I didn't give him back a wolf. Rather, I gave him a piece of the void. I wrapped my silence around his soul, creating a shield that no poison or fog could ever break. And all at once, everything changed. His eyes didn't turn gold, they turned a brilliant, shimmering silver. In the quiet that followed, Silas stood up. He wasn't a shifter anymore, but he was something more powerful. He was a king who was balanced by the void, which meant he could walk through the silver fog without feeling a single sting. She felt it clear as day. The open loop of his feral nature was gone. He was finally whole. Silas looked at his hands. Then, at me, and a slow, lethal smile spread across his face. Chapter 27. The Shadow and the Storm. What followed was a plan that was more suicide than strategy. Still, we didn't have any other choice. The ritual was almost finished, and if the global silver fog was released, every shifter on the planet would become a mindless slave to Alaric and Valerius. Because Silas was now immune to their magic, he was the only one who could get close enough to the staff to break it. "We need to get to the high dome," Silas said. His voice was no longer a growl. It was a cold, sharp blade. Moments later, we were running through the lower levels. Every guard that tried to stop us was met with a pulse of my void energy or the brutal, human strength of a king who had nothing left to lose. In fact, we moved like a single entity. Have you ever seen two people move as if they were one soul? That was us. To make things worse, we could hear the chanting from above. The mountain was humming with a dark, oily energy. As the silence roared, I realized that Valerius wasn't just using my power, he was using the life force of the shifters in the city. She didn't know what scared her more, the power they were building, or the fact that Silas's father was the one leading the charge. "Silas, if we do this, the mountain might fall," I warned as we reached the final staircase. "Then let it fall," Silas replied, not even slowing down. As though fate whispered, he grabbed a discarded sword from a fallen guard. Because he was now shielded by my void, the silver blade didn't burn his skin. It just gleamed in the light. Truth be told, he looked more like a god of war than he ever had as a wolf. He turned to me, his silver eyes burning. "Are you ready to kill a ghost king, Elara?" Chapter 28. The Ascent to War. Soon after, we burst through the final gates of the high dome. The sky outside the glass was a swirling vortex of purple poison, and the room was filled with the smell of burning blood. Next, I saw them. Valerius was standing at the center of a stone circle, his staff raised high, while Alaric stood behind him, his hand on the Archon's shoulder. They looked like the kings of a dead world. "You're too late!" Valerius screamed, his voice amplified by the stolen magic. Because the ritual was at its peak, the white light from his staff was blinding. "The fog is already moving. By the time the sun sets, the world will be ours." Still, Silas didn't stop. He walked into the circle, the purple mist swirling around him but never touching his skin. As the silence roared, Alaric's eyes widened in shock. He tried to use his shadow magic to pin Silas down, but the shadows just dissolved when they hit the void shield I was feeding into the bond. No matter how hard she tried, the guards couldn't stop us either. I just sent a wave of white energy that knocked everyone back. "Father," Silas's voice echoed through the dome. And just like that, everything changed. He didn't shift. He didn't roar. He just swung the sword with a surgical precision I had taught him. In the span of a breath, the blade cut through the air, heading straight for the Archon's staff. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I reached out and grabbed the energy in the room, pulling it all into my own body to give Silas the opening he needed. Before the words left her lips, the sword hit the staff. What followed was a sound that I will never forget. It was the sound of a world breaking. As the sky darkened, a massive wave of white and purple energy exploded outward, throwing everyone to the floor. Deep down, she knew the truth. The ritual was broken, but the cost was going to be higher than we ever imagined. Chapter 29. The Fall of the False Kings. The sound of a god dying is a lot quieter than I expected. The explosion of white light had turned the high dome into a vacuum of pure, ringing silence. And for a long moment, I couldn't even feel my own heartbeat. In the quiet that followed, the purple mist of the silver fog didn't just fade, it vanished. I lay on the cracked marble floor, my lungs burning as I tried to draw a breath. Because the explosion had used every bit of the void energy in my body, I felt as light as a feather and as heavy as a mountain all at once. Still, I forced my eyes open. The first thing I saw was the shattered remains of Valerius's white staff. Next, I looked for Silas. As if pulled by a string, my gaze found him standing in the center of the wreckage. He was breathing hard, the silver sword still clutched in his hand. But then, I saw Alaric and Valerius. The High Archon was slumped against the throne, his eyes wide and vacant. The stolen energy had been too much for his body to hold, and it had simply burned him out from the inside. To make things worse, the Ghost King Alaric was flickering like a dying candle. "It's over, Father," Silas said. His voice was steady, but her heart ached for the pain I knew was hiding underneath. Because Silas had broken the staff, the bond that kept Alaric in this world was gone. That's why the man who had caused so much death was finally turning into smoke. You chose a human," Alaric hissed, his voice fading into the wind. "You have destroyed the legacy." "No," Silas replied, stepping toward me. The moment their eyes locked, I saw a light in him that was brighter than any crown. "I have saved the future." And all at once, everything changed. Alaric let out one final, bitter snarl before he dissolved into a cloud of black ash. In the span of a breath, the shadows in the room went still. The war was over. She felt it clear as day. No more lead. No more lies. No more living in the dark. Chapter 30. The King's Rebirth. Moments later, the mountain began to groan. Shards of glass fell from the ceiling, and I knew the Obsidian Citadel couldn't hold much longer. Without thinking, Silas ran to me. He scooped me up into his arms. His grip so tight, it felt like he was trying to merge our souls back together. Because of that, I buried my face in his neck, breathing in the scent of cedar and victory. "The mountain is falling, Silas," I shouted over the sound of the crumbling stone. "Then let it fall," he said again. But this time, he was smiling. What followed was a frantic escape through the falling debris. Rather than shifting into a wolf, Silas moved with a new kind of grace. The void I had given him was still pulsing in his veins, making him stronger and faster than any shifter I had ever known. She didn't know what scared her more, the rocks falling around them, or the way she never wanted to let go of him. Eventually, we burst through the main gates, just as the high dome collapsed inward. A massive cloud of dust billowed out, covering the valley in gray. By the time the air cleared, The shifters of the city were standing there. Thousands of them. They had been freed from the fog, and they were watching the ruins of their old world. As the silence roared, they saw Silas standing there, with a human woman in his arms. Just like that, a low, rumbling sound began to grow. It wasn't a growl of anger. It was a howl of respect. As her wolf stirred, I felt the primal resonance snap back into place. It wasn't a chain anymore. It was a bridge. Because we had faced the darkness together, the bond was now unbreakable. Silas set me down on my feet and turned to his people. Under the weight of his stare, every shifter in the valley dropped to one knee. He was their king, and I was their savior. Chapter 31. The Dawn of the Obsidian Queen. Come morning, the sun rose over a different world. Truth be told, the Obsidian Citadel was a ruin, but the people were alive. After that, Silas and I sat on a ledge overlooking the valley. We were covered in soot and blood, but I had never seen him look so peaceful. Because the Ghost King was gone, the static in Silas's head was finally quiet. He didn't need a Voidborn to be his medicine anymore. He just needed me to be his mate. What happens now? I asked, leaning my head on his shoulder. Her voice trembled with a joy I hadn't felt since I was a child. Now we build something new, Silas said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. It wasn't made of the forbidden silver. It was pure, shimmering moonsteel. As if fate demanded it, he slid it onto my finger. No more Shadow Society. No more secrets. A kingdom where a healer can be a queen and a wolf can find peace. Soon after, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the desperate, hungry kiss of the battlefield. It was soft. It was warm. It was a promise of 1,000 tomorrows. In that moment, I realized that my void was never a curse. It was the space where love could grow without fear. In fact, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever owned, which meant I was no longer the woman of silence. I was the woman of the light. What followed was a year of hard work and deep laughter. Not only that, but we turned the lower levels of the mountain into a hospital for everyone, shifter and human alike. Deep down, she knew the truth. We had changed the world because we were brave enough to be vulnerable. Between them, something cracked. And what came out was a love that was stronger than any ancient magic. Silas was the shadow, and I was the storm, and together, we were the heartbeat of the mountain. Chapter 32. The Fairy Tale. That night, exactly 1 year after I found a dying beast in the rain, we returned to the mist-veiled ridge. Still, it didn't look like a prison anymore. The cabin had been rebuilt, and the forest felt like it was holding its breath in a good way. As the wind shifted, I smelled the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. Because we were home, I felt a sense of ultimate belonging that made my chest ache with happiness. Looking back, I should have known, I murmured as we stood on the porch. Silas was behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist. Known what? He asked, his chin resting on the top of my head. That a king doesn't just claim your heart, I said, turning in his arms to look into his silver eyes. He heals it, and all at once, everything changed. Silas let out a low, happy growl and picked me up, carrying me over the threshold. The space between them burned with a familiar, sizzling desire, but it was a fire that gave life. Instead of taking it, in the stillness that followed, I looked at my hands. I didn't need lead-lined gloves. I didn't need to hide. As the mark tingled on my neck, I knew that our story was just beginning. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just a surgeon and a wolf finding their way out of the dark. Anyway, it was a fairy tale that was all our own. As though fate whispered, I closed my eyes and let the silence take us. And for the first time in my life, the silence was beautiful. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic paranormal romances and fated mate audiobooks.